All right, so today, a large majority of the day is going to be working in your breakout groups to come up with ideas for your own research project. Hopefully you had a chance to look at that virtual manipulation sheet I sent you. It had a lot of good ideas about IVs and some other experimental designs that were done in the past. So hopefully you found that useful. But there's a couple things we need to talk about before we get into breakout groups and start coming up with ideas. So this is a brief overview of today's agenda. Assignment number 1, so you should be able to find your grade and then also the comments I left on your Word document on eCampus. I believe you can just go to like where the actual grade is and see that I left feedback, and I left feedback in the form of I just uploaded the Word document. Please let me know if you can't see it and I'll help you find it. I personally myself don't know exactly where it is, but I believe that's where it is. So please let me know if you haven't found it. Students in my previous class said they found it, no problem. So hopefully other people have found it. You can't hear me. Okay, I was saying, can anyone else hear me? Natalie, you may want to back out and come back in. I was hoping I wasn't muted because that would have been rather embarrassing. Yeah, so Natalie, just like leave and come back. Yeah, so assignment number 1 can be found on eCampus. My only suggestion is in the future, if you have any questions about why some of the things that you said were not APA errors, please let me know. I know like a lot of groups thought that like saying EG, example, like you shouldn't say that in a paper. That's perfectly fine. And I can talk more, with you individually if you want to meet during my office hours. Don't worry about the grade too much. There are plenty of opportunities to make that grade up. My only other offer of suggestion is make sure you read all the instructions. I think it was very clear that a lot of groups, or maybe individuals in groups, didn't really read the instructions. Dr. Tenenholtz gave you a great breakdown of like every section and how many errors and what they were in each section. And, people just did not identify them. And I think it'd be pretty easy to check back and be like, oh, wait, there's supposed to be 15 errors in here and I only found 2. That might be a sign to be like, maybe you should go back in and check. Anyways, please come see me if you have any questions about assignment number 1. We're also going to talk about assignment number 2. I'm going to have some people offer up some of their ideas, and then we can talk about them a little bit. Then I'm going to do like a brief overview of between versus within subjects designs. We're going to kind of talk about last class and talk about if there's any different ways that we could do it. We already done that last class. I'm going to go relatively fast through it. And then finally, we can do an overview of group projects, and we can start brainstorming topics within your own groups. So in regards to assignment number 2, can someone give me an example of, where is it? Can someone give me an example of what they put for experiment number 1? So for experiment number 1, you had to create a scenario manipulation. So like, i.e. using a vignette, to manipulate stress level, which is your IV, and a self-report measure of eating behavior. So can someone tell me what they did? Emma?
I said that I would show them, or I would show 2 groups, either a calm video or a stressful video. So like somebody doing parkour, like in a really big building and like all that stuff, or like puppies running around in a field. And then I would measure that by having a questionnaire of how tempted people are, or they are to eat something after watching those videos. And then the manipulation checks, I said that, what did I say? Oh, I said like, did you think that this video was actually stressful? Like, did you actually feel stressed after watching this video?
Can you or anyone else think of any potential confounds for that research design? And this could be within your specific study, or anyone else on their own scenario number 1.
For my confounds, I said if somebody ate before the experiment already. So okay. Like they wouldn't really be hungry if they,
Sure, that's something that we could definitely control. We're not control for, but you'd want to tell participants, kind of like in a medical test where they tell you, don't eat, 30 minutes prior. We could try to make sure that all participants are coming in the same level field of not having eaten. Are there any other potential confounds anyone came up, Natalie?
Would another confounding variable be like the same type of questions in the self-report measure, like to make sure like the both groups had like the same questions or like type of questions, or would that be a different variable?
So I'd assume that all of the dependent variable questions are the same for both groups. So whenever you're designing an experimental study, the manipulations can be different, right? You can have a control group and you can have your manipulation group, but you'd want your outcome measure to be the exact same because otherwise you wouldn't be able to compare them. Think about when you do a t-test, you need to have the same outcome so you can compare the two groups. Kylie?
I was just going to say, like, when some people are stressed, they don't eat. Like, they don't have an appetite when they're stressed.
Okay. Yeah. So it was parkour, right? If I'm remembering, I'm getting all mine mixed up. So let's say with your IV was like a parkour video. What if someone's really interested in parkour and does a lot of good parkour, right? So, or not really, is really good at parkour. So that might not be stressful to them, so you got to think about how your IV is perceived by others. All right, good job. How about the next one? Can someone give me an example of, let me see if I can find it, of experiment number 2. So using an environmental manipulation to manipulate stress and an observational method to measure your dependent variable of eating behavior. First off, can someone tell me what an observational method is to measure? Like, tell me how you would do an observational method. Julia?
You could have researchers sit in and kind of pretend to be participants, and they could observe while they're participating, per se.
Sure. And then they would be jotting down on a notebook or recording it somehow of how many times someone did something, right? That's a good way to do an observational measure. So does someone want to offer up, just briefly describe what their experiment was? Skylar?
I have no idea if this works or makes sense. I did 2 groups going and eating in a food court, like a mall food court, and the experimental group would be like on a stage eating to where like everybody could see them, and the control group could sit like anywhere in the food court they wanted. I feel like that would definitely induce like the stress, and the observational method would just be like seeing how they react and seeing if they even like want to eat or finish their food based on like if the control group acts the same way or not. Does that work?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. You have an observational method of eating behavior. It could just be something as simple as, do they even eat? How many times do they eat? It could be maybe you had chips in front of you. How many chips did they actually eat? And your hypothesis would probably be that people on the stage are going to eat less than people, who are eating normally. Can anyone think of any confounds? So think of something that could cause your participants not to act in the way that you think they should act.
I was thinking like maybe they wouldn't even be embarrassed like to eat in front of people, like that wouldn't even embarrass them.
Sure. What if you had a bunch of performers, right, and that are taking your study, or several performers? Probably eating on a stage is not as stress-inducing as singing in front of a group of people, right? So if you have people who aren't or don't have stage fright, which it's safe to say a majority of people do, but you would want to make sure that you either have an equal amount of like performers and not performers, or you have to control for this or assess this in some way. It'd be a great way for a manipulation check, right? Was this actually stressful? So that would be a good way to ask your participants in your intervention condition to be like, just ask them right up, how stressed were you after this, right? That'd be a good way to assess if it was actually stressful. Good job. And then finally, for experiment number 3, using an instructional manipulation and a physiological method to measure your dependent variable of eating behavior. I'm going to say right off the bat, I'm going to be pretty lenient when it comes to a physiological measure of eating behavior. I'd assume that this was a little bit difficult to come up with. So does anyone want to share what they came up with? Keely?
So I had the experimental group have 2 minutes to answer a statistics question with like no formula given, and they were told that the answer had to be correct within the 2 minutes. So that's kind of stressful. And in the control group, they had all the time in the world to answer the question, but it had to be correct as well. But they were kind of told in like a less serious tone. Um, and and I did having their heartbeats counted while completing the question.
Okay, yeah, so that is a physiological measure. It's probably not a physiological measure of eating behavior, but yeah, that's a good physiological measure, heart rate, or heartbeats per minute. Does someone else want to, let's see, who hasn't, Natalie, Julia?
I had participants kind of like how Keely did, but I had them do a large puzzle, and one group had all the time in the world to do it, and the other group had only 15 minutes to complete it. And then afterwards, I had them like sit in a waiting room with like food out, and like they could eat as much as they wanted. And before and after, so before they did the puzzle and everything, I measured their cholesterol. And then after the puzzle, I also measured their cholesterol after like however much food was consumed. But the only problem that I said was some people have naturally high cholesterol or low cholesterol. So yeah.
Yep, so that would be something you'd have to control for or assess prior. Yeah, doing a physiological study, there's a lot of things, into play beyond a traditional experimental design. Good job. So these are great examples. These are just some things to think about, some confounding variables, some maybe manipulation checks. But yeah, so let's go ahead and move on. So I know I asked this before last week, but can someone tell me the difference between a between and a within subjects design? Brianna? Is it Brianna or Brianna?
It's Brianna.
Brianna, okay.
So for between, that's where you have two separate groups and they get two different levels of the independent variable. And within subject design, the group gets both levels, like one group of participants gets both.
Perfect. So you can all still see my screen, right? My PowerPoint? Cool. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I could have said it better. So different participants receive different levels of the IV for the between subjects design. There has to be a minimum of 2, but there can be, as many as you want. And we'll talk a little bit more about designing your experiment, how many levels to keep it to, but we can get to that in a few slides. But there's different levels. There's different types of between subjects designs. So last week, those 3 experiments were all just basic. You just had two levels and just a simple test afterwards, right? A simple outcome measure afterwards. But you could have a pre-test, post-test design. So you would assess, your outcome before you do the intervention and after you do the intervention as well. So that would be your one condition. And then, before your neutral condition and then after your neutral stimulus, or, whatever you want to call it. And see if there's any changes, right? And you would expect that your intervention condition would have a greater change than your neutral condition. You can have a matched design, where this is where you're making sure that participants are matched in some variable or concept prior to starting the study. So, think about, we talked about in the dress example last week, we talked about how, well, we maybe want an equal amount of people in each group who knew about dresses, right? So maybe you just wanted to limit to girls first off, to not even include any boys, because I'm not sure, I know myself, have no idea what the price of a prom dress or a Golden Globes dress. I would have a lot of variability. But maybe you would want to, assess prior knowledge of dresses and make sure you had an equal amount. Think back to the math one. Maybe you'd want to match people on SAT, right? Or math SAT score. So that way you would have an equal amount of people who are both good and bad at math in each section. A match design is really good at making sure that you can control for these variables that you think will impact your results. And then you have a quasi-experimental design, which is essentially just that your participants aren't assigned at random. It's basically like a basic design, but they're just not assigned at random. And then of course we have the within subjects design where the same participants receive all levels of the IV. One of the decisions that you're going to have to make for your own experimental design is, what do you want to do? With some designs like, actually, we'll go to the next slide. So we talked about this last time, so I'm just going to briefly go over this. But, think back to last week's experiments. Knowing what you know now, like, would you choose a different design? So think about the price estimate one, the dress one. Do you think how we did it is the best way to do it, or would you do one of these? Would you change the study in some way and do one of these designs? Does anyone have any ideas? Julia?
I think I still would have kept it as a between subject, but I think I would have changed it to like a matched subject design, just because of what you said, like how to make it all girls so that the data would be more accurate, because most girls know what a dress typically costs.
Yeah, good job. Yeah, I agree with you that a within subjects design would not work. And in the same vein, a pre-test, post-test would not work as well. Like, especially within, think about it. Once you do one condition, you've already been primed to think like, oh, okay, these are prom dresses. And then you get to the next condition, you're like, okay, now they're Golden Globe. Like, you're already going to be thinking back to the previous one, and it's just going to cause some problems. So good job. Let's see, what's the next one? Think about the vignette one. Would you change it or would you keep it the way we did it last time? I'm going to go back to this just so you can see what options there are. Keely.
I was gonna say you could probably do a pre-test or post-test by measuring like their happiness before they read it versus after, maybe.
Yeah, so I think with the pre-test, post-test, and within subject, it could cause a little bit of problem. It's doable, but once people have given their responses, it might highlight, it might narrow down their thinking, and they might be resistant to change. So, the way you answered the first time, like, it might not change as much after you've read the second one. I personally think the basic design is probably best for this one, how we've done it. But yeah, but maybe you could work it so that a pre-test, post-test is doable. And then finally, how about the math one? I think both of the first two ones, we probably did it best doing basic, but I think we could change the math one a bit to make it a little bit better. Does anyone have any ideas about how to change the math experiment we did? Meredith.
I think for the math one, pre-test, post-test could be used, because if you gave like everyone like a pre-math test and then use the experiment when like the music played, you could compare the results.
Sure, yeah. In similar vein, I think a within subjects design would also work. So you could have participants, and be randomized whether they get the intervention first or the neutral one first. But yeah, you could have a participant. Let's deal with a within subject design right now. You could have participants take do the normal one with no audio distraction, see how many math problems they get right, and then you could have them do the intervention one with the audio distraction and see how many math questions they get right. And your hypothesis would be that the audio distraction would cause them to get less math problems. But you'd have to change the design a little bit. Think about and this is a good example of having to do a pilot study. Think about the math test itself. You couldn't have the same questions, right? If you're doing a within subjects design, so participants get both levels, you couldn't have the same math test for each one, because the second time they do it, they'll know some of the answers. So you're going to have to develop two math tests that are essentially equal in how hard they are. So this is a good example of, for your own design, you may have to do a pilot study. So what a pilot study is essentially you're just testing to make sure that your materials are doing what they should be doing. So an easy way to pilot test a math test, right, is to go to your friends and say, take this math test, you have 2 minutes to do it. And then, a day later or an hour later or whatever, give them the other math test, no distractions. It's just simply a math test and you have 2 minutes to do it, and have them fill it out, right, and see how many they get correct. And you could do like a independent samples t-test, and you would hope if your math tests are equal, you should see no difference, right, in the scores. The same condition, there's no distractions or anything, you should see no difference. So this is a good example of, you maybe, if you're going to do within subjects design here, you're going to need 2 equal math tests, you're going to need to pilot test it. So this is something to consider when you're designing your own experiment. Does anyone have any questions about the between versus within subject designs, or the 4 different types of between designs? Okay. Okay, so here is a big important slide that has a lot of basic guidelines for your own experimental design. And these are some things to keep in mind. So you're going to have to manipulate, obviously you're going to have to manipulate an independent variable, so you have at least 2 conditions. So we say 2 plus here. And so in theory, that could mean, 10 conditions. And while, yes, it is possible to have 10 conditions, I highly recommend for your own sanity that you don't do it, because it's a lot of work designing it, and the analyses can become really intricate / a lot to handle. So of course you have to have a minimum of 2, right? Obviously you need like some neutral one and some intervention. But even having 3 is okay. I'm going to make a recommendation to not go more than 4, right? 2 is fine. 2 is great, actually. 3 is good. 4 is really pushing it. If you want to have 4, you can have 4. Don't go above 4 conditions. I would really say don't go above 3, but really don't go above 4. Yeah, you're going to have to measure your outcome using some appropriate technique. You don't need to reinvent the wheel here, right? Use prior research. How did they assess your outcome? In the on eCampus, there's a good folder in the, it's like lab resources, experimental designs. I can get you the exact, there's a slide that tells you exactly where it is, but there's a bunch of good resources. And one of them is, has an entire folder of measures that you could use for your outcome, like validated scales. So if you decide that you want to use a scale for your outcome, maybe you could pick from one of them. Or if you have, something that's not on that list, like a measure or a concept that's not on the list, and you're having problems coming up with something, please, just contact me and I'll be able to help. Of course, you're going to have to determine the appropriate design, what's going to be better, between subjects, and what type of between subjects, or within subjects design. Some studies of within subjects design may be the best option. It might take a little bit longer to collect your data, but it might be the best option. Like we talked about, if you're going to need any pilot testing on any of your materials, make sure you do that. Include a manipulation check if needed. So hopefully my email kind of cleared up what manipulation checks are. It's just a way to assess whether your materials are actually doing what you want them to. So if you want to have participants watch a video of babies playing in leaves, right? And you're hoping that creates some sense of like, oh, or, or some kind of cute feeling, you might want to ask afterwards, how did you feel about this image or this video? Just to make sure. So if you're trying to invoke happiness, right, you're going to want to assess to make sure that your vignette or whatever material you're using actually invoked happiness. So you're not just designing an experiment, right? You have your basic IV and your DV and your experimental design, but you're also going to need to assess demographic variables about your sample. This is to make sure that, think about what you're going to want to report. You're going to want to ask about gender, age. If since you're not just targeting college students, maybe you want to just target college students, right? Since you're putting this survey online and hopefully getting family, friends, anyone you know on social media to take it, It would say your variables may be impacted by how much someone makes a year, right? There could be a design where it would matter how much someone makes. Make sure you assess that, right? You ask them in some form, how much do you make? What is your salary? Some form of that. Make sure you measure any potential confounding variables so you can ensure your groups were roughly equal after they were randomized. You're going to be implementing this experiment using Qualtrics. So if you took 203 last semester, or you've taken some study within the psychology department, you've been a participant using Qualtrics. So we used Qualtrics last semester. So you have an idea of kind of what it looks like. Now you're going to be on the other side, actually, going hands-on and making stuff within Qualtrics. I have a few slides after this that kind of says what Qualtrics can do. I've personally never created a study in it. One of my homework assignments over the weekend is to dive deep into it and figure out what it can and can't do even more so I can help you. So if you have any questions about Qualtrics, I probably won't be able to answer it today, but type it in an email, send it to me, and I'll look into it. And then finally, you're going to be collecting data from at least 100 participants. It sounds like a lot, but just remember, you can put this out online. I recommend putting this on your social media, be like, hey, take our study. Are there any questions about this quick overview of guidelines for this research project? Yeah, it's a big, this is a big project. This is a big task to do, but hopefully, as we'll see on the next slide, it is broken down into hopefully manageable parts. So today is going to be all about, this is a quick timeline of, of the project. Today is going to be about brainstorming topics. And hopefully you can walk away as a group today with a solid idea of at least what your variables are and hopefully how you're going to kind of measure them. You don't have to have specifics, but it would be nice to walk away from today with a general idea. Sometime during this next week, you're going to be meeting with me as a group so that we can really solidify your idea. There is no class next Thursday because it's WVU's like non-instructional day. I don't know what they're calling it. But if you guys want to meet with me as a group on that day at our time, I will be here. You all have to meet with me as a group at least once next week. It's just a matter of when you want to. I would suggest, if you haven't solidified your idea today, requesting a meeting with me potentially over the weekend, because the idea that you come up with is going to guide your assignment number 3, which is finding research articles, which is due next week. So, don't wait until, Wednesday to be like, oh, here's what our idea is, because by that time, you're going to only have a day and a half or whatever to find these research articles and answer all the questions. Not great on your part. By week 5, you're going to have to finalize your project design. And you're going to submit assignment number 4, which is the proposal, by midnight on that class on week 5. I'm going to send out assignment number 4 in an email whenever I send out my weekly email after each class. Just so that you can see, don't start working on it, but just look at the questions that assignment number 4 is going to ask. It has a whole bunch of questions that really guide your thinking into how you're going to design your experiment. It's just a good thing to look at, so that way you can kind of get in the zone and at least start formulating some ideas for these questions. Week 6, you're going to start implementing it into Qualtrics. Week 7, you should have it all done in Qualtrics. Then you're going to begin data collection as soon as Dr. Tenenholtz and I approve, your design on Qualtrics. We make sure that things are actually okay. And then by week 9 or 10, you'll have the data collection. Then we can start with data cleaning and writing it up. I know this was really brief. But does anyone have any questions about the timeline or concerns about the timeline? Okay. So in a little bit, I still have a couple more slides. We're going to get started on these group projects. And, really what I'd suggest today is coming up with these things when you're brainstorming. Come up with a hypothesis. I think this is related to that. Then you can break down, okay, well, how are we going to measure our IV and how we're going to manipulate it? How are we going to measure our DV? And potentially which design works best. So this is something that I came across in my last class, and I'm just going to bring it up now because I think it's important to know. So when you're coming up with your idea, don't start off with, I want to do a scenario manipulation and I want our outcome to be a physio or a self-report measure. Don't start off like that. My suggestion is start off with some general idea. I think this is related to that, right? And think about it as a correlation. You don't even have to think about it as a, this affects us. Think about it as a correlation. I think social media is related to happiness. So I'm just going to use my own research as an example here. Then you can start to think, okay, how would I measure social media, right? Or yeah, how would I measure social media? How can I manipulate it? Well, I could have one group use social media for 5 minutes, and I could have another group just read some neutral stimulus, like a paragraph on birds or whatever, something that isn't going to increase happiness at all. So I have my IV, right? Social media, now I have how it's going to be manipulated. My outcome, probably the best way to measure happiness is to just ask someone, in a Likert scale, how happy you are. Sure, there's other ways that you can measure it, but probably nothing easier than that and more effective than that. And then I can work into which design, would work best, whether it be a between or within, probably a between. But anyways, that's my suggestion. Start off with some general idea, this is related to that, and then work your way down. Don't go the other way. Don't start off with which design I want to do. It's just going to cause you problems. Here's some things to keep in mind when you're coming up with a study. Make it interesting, but simple, but doable, right? Remember, you're in a Psych 204 class, doing this online. Don't make your lives harder than what it has to be. But you also need to make sure there's some theory behind it. Remember, what is the other component, the big component of the lab section of this class is you have to write a paper, right? So, and what is the majority of the introduction, or like almost 95% of the introduction, you're writing about prior research and how theory is guiding your hypothesis. So if there's no theory or background research guiding your hypothesis, you're not going to have anything, right? You have no introduction. You have, no half of a discussion where you have to relate your findings to prior work. So you can't write a paper about it. So make sure that you're using prior theory to guide you, or prior work to guide you. And while you're reading this prior work, it's going to spark ideas about how you can measure your IV and how you can measure your DV. Remember that, like I said, it's going to be implemented online. So there are some things that you may be limited in. But I think most of the things that you can do in person, you could probably do online, but there are obviously some limitations to doing it online. Think of the time constraints, not only the time constraints of like, oh, we only have a semester or a couple weeks to do this, but also, make sure you're working well within your group. You're going to have to communicate outside of class. And as a reminder, I believe during the midterm grades and the final grades, report on group members who are not pulling their weight. I don't know what's happening in your group, and so that's the only way we can appropriately assign the grades. And then ethics. So obviously don't do anything unethical, but a general rule is if you wouldn't want to be a participant in your own study, and it might not even be ethical reasons, maybe it's just too time consuming, right? Maybe you design an experiment and it just, you want them to do, I don't know, something every day all week, right? If you wouldn't want to do it yourself, you can't expect your participants to do it. So make it realistic and something that people can actually do. Does anyone have any questions about anything here, but more specifically, any questions about that first part where I talked about how to develop an idea? Start off with something big. How can you measure your IV? How can you measure your DV? And then come up with a design. Don't go the other way. I've seen groups try to do it the other way. It's not going to work. I really suggest the idea of like, think of a correlation. I think this is related to this, and then you can design the experiment. All right, so this folder within eCampus has a lot of good information. So it can be found under lab materials, other resources, experimental design. It has that paper that I sent you earlier this week called Virtual Manipulations, it has a bunch of good ideas for independent variables. And it also has some other group projects, and I believe they were all done online. So, or if not, you could adapt them if you want to take one of their ideas. Also in this folder is a big list of validated scales. So if you have an idea, for a dependent variable and you want to use like a Likert scale, it may be in that. So just double check that. And it has some article examples of experimental designs. And I don't think assignment number 4 is in there, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in there and email it to you. But this is the project proposal and has like a project brainstorming worksheet. It just has a lot. It's good to look at now so that way you can narrow in your thinking. But yeah, make sure you check out this folder in eCampus because it has a lot of good information. All right, so I have a couple slides on Qualtrics before we break out into groups. It's intuitive, easy to use. It's also free to WVU students. So also within that eCampus folder, there's a link to Qualtrics. I'd suggest going in there, spending a few minutes and just looking around and seeing what it can do. This is something I'm going to do this weekend so that I can help you more next week and whenever we're actually designing these studies. But here's some things that it can do. So for experiments, for between subjects, it can randomly assign participants to conditions. Well, so they'll have different experiences so that you don't have to manually assign people yourself. They'll click on it, you'll put this link on social media and it'll just randomly assign them. If you're doing it within subjects, so whenever you do a within subject study, you want to vary the order in which they receive the intervention. You want some people may potentially to receive the intervention first, other people to receive it second. So it can also randomize the order in which they receive it. Here's some other things that it can do. It can show different types of material. So, you can have static text. So if you want a vignette or put instructions, you can throw it on there. You can put pictures. You can link to outside sites. So if you want participants to watch a YouTube video on anything to invoke an emotion, perhaps, you can have them do that. Apparently, you can't easily put music or videos inside the survey. So like you have to link them to outside sources. It says easily, so I'm assuming it can be done. I'm going to look into it because it would be nice not to have your participants go to like YouTube, but rather, it's just in the survey. I'll look into it to see what we can do. But it can also ask different types of questions. You can have multiple choice, scale, sliders, and then open response. You can also control and measure the timing of pages. So you can require a certain amount of time before advancing. This is really important if you want to make sure your participants are actually reading. You don't want a participant, you give them a vignette and they just do skip next, let me just get through this as fast as possible. You want to make sure that like, okay, they have to actually sit here for 30 seconds to read it or a minute or however long you want. So you can advance the page after a set amount of time. You can measure the time to complete a full page of questions. So if you want to know how long it takes them to, to answer 10 math questions, and you can figure out how long it takes to answer all 10. It does some cool stuff with scoring that makes your life a little bit easier. It can determine the correctness of answers. So if you have math problems, it can do the math. It can figure out the score for you, so you don't have to go in by hand. But it can also assign points to different responses on scales. So what do we mean by this? We did this in 203, and it's called reverse scoring. So let's say you have a scale, and they're all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you have one question where you need to reverse score it. Well, you could do it in SPSS, right? Or apparently Qualtrics can do it for you. So that just makes your life a little bit easier. Additionally, it can also sum up the scores. So you can create a total score scale, or you can create a total score from your scale, and so that way you don't have to do it in SPSS. So Qualtrics does some nice things for you. So like I said, if anyone has any questions right now about Qualtrics, just hold on to them because I probably won't be able to answer it. But send me an email and I'll see what I can do. I'm going to look into it this weekend and try to learn more about it because I've never used it. I'm excited to get into it. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Yeah, so this is what I've already talked about this. So I'm just going to touch on it. Use previous research to help you develop your own project. Other researchers have done hopefully what you've been doing or in some fashion. So, how did they manipulate their IV? How did they measure their outcome? So just, look at other research. And this is what partly assignment number 3 is going to be all about, which we're going to get into in the next slide. But use prior research to help you develop your own, right? Like I said before, don't reinvent the wheel. If it's already been done and validated in a published study, probably a good idea. Or you can use portions of their ideas. All right, so this is assignment number 3. Not going to go too much into it. If you were 203 last semester, it's exactly the same, but just, on this research idea. The general premise is you're going to come up with an idea in your groups. I'm going to use my social media one, where you want to look at social media and how it impacts happiness. So, you're each individually are going to have to find 3 articles on social media and happiness. Hopefully they're experimental studies. That would be nice if they're experimental studies, so you can see how they manipulated their IV and measured their DV. But anyways, you need 3 primary source scientific articles on your topic. This is due next Friday because we don't have class on Thursday, and it's not due on Thursday, it's due Friday. You can have some overlap with group members, but it's in your best interest to all have different articles, right? Because you can pull them together later whenever you're writing your paper. So if everyone chooses the same 3 articles, that just means you're going to have to find more later. So go ahead and, collaborate with each other in a sense that, oh, I chose these 3, I chose these 3. If there's 1 or 2 people that have overlapping articles, that's fine, but try to all have different articles. This says here, make sure you have full text access. Well, obviously you want to read your article, right? So you need full text access. And it says include a link to the article or the first page with your assignment. Don't include the first page. I'll send this in an email afterwards, but include a DOI. So, whenever we cite things, right, it has the DOI. And the cool things about DOI is I can just highlight or just click the DOI and it'll bring me right to that article. Right, it'll bring me to, if it's open access, it'll bring me to the full article. Otherwise, it'll bring me to like an abstract of the article. So, for whatever articles that you use, it'll always have the citation, right? You always have a citation for it. Just give me the DOI so that way I can go back to it. I'll write more in an email, but just give me a DOI. You don't need to include the first page. And I hesitate to say include a link because remember, you can't use the Psych info link. So like you can't just copy the link if you're using Psych info because it won't bring me to it. It just don't use the Psych info URL. Give me the DOI. So for each article, go to assignment number 3 on eCampus. There's just a bunch of questions that you have to address. Go ahead and do that. This is important. Be sure to paraphrase. So I don't know off the top of my head what the specific questions are, but if it asks you, how did they measure the IV? Do not copy and paste, their material section for that variable. Don't do it. That's plagiarism. You're going to be written up for plagiarism, and I don't want to have to write people up for plagiarism, especially on the first, the first major assignment. You don't want it. Just paraphrase it in your own words. Please don't copy and paste. And like I said, summaries are due next Friday. Anyone have any questions about assignment number 3? Okay. Yeah, I'm briefly touch on this. So there's some resources on eCampus if you are curious about, how do I really read a research article? And where do I find these research articles? Psych info, great. Go to WVU libraries, databases, Psych info. Use Google Scholar. That's another good one. We have materials in eCampus to help you find how to find research. Yeah, so I think one of the key points here is how to read a research article. So if you took 203 with us, we kind of talk about how to read it. But for a lot of these studies, don't get bogged down in the details too much. Especially within the results section. So even when I read research articles, there a lot of times I don't understand the results, right? They're talking about some advanced statistical methodology for what they did. I don't know. I don't care. I don't know. What you really care about is, the discussion. Typically, the first paragraph of the discussion, they summarize their results in really easy to read English. So, I would suggest just very briefly glancing over the stats if you want, but really focus in on how they're describing their findings. But also make sure that you're reading the articles and you're actually getting something out of them in the sense, focus on how they're measuring their IV, how they're measuring their DV, and how they did their experiment. Because it's going to help you design your own study. And this can be found under lab materials, other resources, the couple of the things that I've talked about. All right. So here are the groups. I'm going to assign you into your breakout rooms. Just remember, the main point of today is to come up with some general idea. This is related to that, and potentially start thinking about ways that you can measure your independent variable or manipulate your independent variable and measure your dependent variable. Are there any questions about anything that I talked about today, or the expectations for what you should get done today in your groups while brainstorming your ideas?